Dogs are considered to be man's best friend, although this may be an overstatement. However, it is undeniable that dogs were loved and cared for on board the luxury ocean liner, the RMS Titanic. The strong affection for the dogs was evident in the stories and myths surrounding these canine companions. In honor of National Dog Day, we will retell the story of the dogs that were aboard, focusing on their lives on board the ship and addressing the myths about what happened after the sinking. During the Titanic's maiden voyage, 12 dogs were brought on board, all of which belonged to first-class passengers. Captain Edward J. Smith also had a dog, a Russian wolfhound named Ben, whom he cherished deeply. Although not all 12 dogs are named on the passenger list, it is known that there were several breeds on board, including a Chow Chow, a King Charles Spaniel, and a few Pomeranian dogs. Some of the named dogs belonged to wealthy first-class passengers, and these dogs would have included an Airedale named Kitty, owned by the richest man on board, John Jacob Astor IV, a toy poodle named Frou Frou, owned by Helen Bishop, 8 Spritz dogs, owned by Captain Edward Crosby, a Pyrenees dog named Sun Yat-sen, owned by Henry and Myra Harper, and a French bulldog named Gammon de Picombe, who belonged to Robert Williams Daniel, and please forgive me if I pronounce Gammon's name wrong. Out of all the dogs on board the Titanic, Gammon was the only dog that was purchased before the ship's departure. Daniels bought him while on a business trip in England, paying £150 for the pooch. First-class passengers were the only ones allowed to bring their dogs on board, presumably due to the cost of their staterooms, and they were required to carry their dogs' tickets. It was considered a privilege for the dogs, as second and third-class passengers were not allowed to bring their animals on board. There was one rule for first-class passengers who bought their dogs, and that rule was the dogs were not allowed to stay inside their cabins. Despite these rules, some passengers kept their dogs in their cabins throughout the entire voyage, which was against the policy of the White Star Line. Naughty, naughty. For those who didn't stay in their owners' cabins, the dogs on board the Titanic were kept in kennel facilities on board the boat deck, located at the aft of funnel number 4. The dogs were cared for by Chief Butcher Alfred Maytham and the other butchers. Maytham and his team would take the dogs for walks on the boat deck and ensure that they had a daily bathroom break. Passengers, especially children like Eva Hart, were permitted to visit the dogs. 7-year-old Eva was particularly fond of Robert Williams Daniel's dog, Gammon, and she and her father would often visit the kennels to see him. However, other sources suggest that Gammon stayed in Daniel's cabin, A15, though if this were true, it could be a case of Gammon staying in the kennels during the day. During the voyage, it was believed that an announcement had been made about a dog show that was supposed to take place on Monday the 15th of April, and this dog show would have been hosted by Samuel Levi Goldenberg and his wife Nella. However, as we all know, this event never took place. On the night of the 14th of April 1912, the RMS Titanic collided with an iceberg, leading many owners to make difficult decisions. There are no records of how the dogs reacted to the collision, but there are records detailing what happened to the dogs on board. The 3 dogs that survived were the smallest breeds on board the ship. They were Margaret Hayes's Pomeranian, Lady, who boarded lifeboat number 7, While in Margaret Hayes's arms and wrapped in blankets, both the pooch and her mistress would bump into James Clinch Smith, who would make a joke about Lady, saying, "I suppose we ought to put on a life preserver on the little doggy too." Margaret Hayes would later go on to look after Michel Navratil Jr. and his younger brother Edmund. It was reported that the boys regularly played with Lady on board the RMS Carpathia. Sun Yat-sen, the Harper's Pekingese dog, also survived the disaster. Having stayed for most of the voyage in the Harper's cabin D-33, the pooch and the Harpers escaped the sinking vessel in lifeboat number 3. Sun Yat-sen had waited in the first-class gymnasium, and after staying inside, the trio made their way to the boat deck and all got in with no objections from the occupants on board. The last dog, another Pomeranian belonging to Martin and Elizabeth Rothschild, survived in lifeboat number 6. There's no record of the name of the Rothschild dog, but in the aftermath of the disaster, an unnamed crew member on board the Carpathia refused to allow the dog to come on board. In response, while in the lifeboat, Elizabeth refused to leave until her dog was allowed on board, and eventually the crew member gave in. Not long after the disaster, the Pomeranian died, but there's no conclusion as to how he passed away. Different sources suggested that he died after getting into a fight with another dog, or he got run over by a carriage in New York after Elizabeth and the dog disembarked from the Carpathia on the 18th of April. 9 died during the sinking, and for some, there are records from passengers that explain when they were last seen on board the ship. While we can't name all of their last moments, the ones that are going to be mentioned will tug at the heartstrings, so you might want to get some tissues at the ready. When the ship was listing, Helen Bishop had to make a hard decision to leave her toy dog behind, and it was a decision she would regret for the rest of her life. Helen had acquired Frou Frou as a gift from her husband, Dixon Bishop, upon the news of her pregnancy. The couple and the dog travelled to Cherbourg after an extended holiday and boarded the Titanic to return home to Michigan. When the trio boarded the Titanic, one officer said to the Bishops, before dropping Frou Frou off in the kennels, "A beauty like her could sleep with us." Upon entering their cabin in B-49, Helen had made a bed with some suitcases and blankets. On the night of the sinking, the Bishops were alerted by their steward of the disaster and that they were needed to get up on deck. When they left their cabin for the last time, Helen asked if she could bring Frou Frou with them. She was refused, but Dixon assured Helen that the trouble was a necessary precaution and that Frou Frou would be safe and that they will be back on board soon. However, Frou Frou didn't want to be separated from Helen and clung to her dress, breaking the seam so she could come with them. As the couple left their cabin, Dixon locked the door so Frou Frou would stay there. The little toy dog went down with the Titanic while the Bishops survived. It was likely that she was drowned. Another dog that didn't make it was Kitty, John Jacob Astor IV's favourite companion. Kitty had been on an extended honeymoon in Europe and Egypt with Astor and his newly wedded wife, Madeline Force Astor. During a day in Egypt, Kitty wandered away from the couple on a trip up the Nile River. Astor was greatly distressed over losing Kitty and spent a great deal of time looking for her. He didn't find her when the couple went upriver. However, when they came downriver, Kitty was found on board the Astor's boat, and it was stopped when she and Astor saw each other. Kitty gave joyous barks after their reunion. Oh, isn't that sweet? After learning that Madeline was pregnant, the couple booked a passage home on the Titanic to New York City. Kitty was kept inside the Astors' room during the voyage. Astor and Madeline took frequent walks around the decks with Kitty on the lead during the voyage. When the ship struck the iceberg, Kitty was believed to have accompanied the Astors in the first-class gymnasium and on the deck. Madeline got into a lifeboat, but Astor took a step back from lifeboat number 4 after he was refused entry, telling his wife, "The sea is calm and you will be all right. I will meet you in the morning." The occupants in the lifeboat caught a last glimpse of Kitty running along the upper deck, uphill to the rising stern. Little is known about what happened to Kitty, but she perished in the sinking along with her master. Following the sinking, there had been a series of insurance claims against the White Star Line, with a few being placed on several animals, including 3 dogs. And I have done a video about the insurance claims between the White Star Line and Lloyd's of London, and I will include the link above the video if you want to check it out. Also after the sinking, and it continues to this day, there have been a series of myths surrounding the Titanic disaster. 3 famous myths involving dogs have been debunked due to lack of evidence, or that they were created by the media for sympathetic reactions for their readers. The first myth, which may or may not have happened, was when someone let the dogs escape from the kennels. Popular belief is that there were surviving records of people on board the sinking ship who saw the dogs running along the upper deck, and that they were rescued by John Jacob Astor IV. However, if it was true, chances are that the real identity of the person who rescued the dogs from the kennels would have been Robert Williams Daniel. Another myth that was debunked involved a passenger named Anne Elizabeth Isham, who refused to leave the Titanic when she learnt that her Great Dane couldn't come with her into a lifeboat. Both Isham and her Great Dane didn't survive. Another source suggests that both bodies were found in the water, with Isham climbing onto her dog around her arms. In reality, there are no claims of Anne having a dog at all, so again, it's a myth. But the biggest myth of all was the story of Rigel, a Newfoundland owned by First Officer William Murdoch. It was written in a newspaper article that during the sinking, Rigel swam around lifeboat number 4 to protect the occupants on board. Rigel was spotted swimming around the Carpathia, guiding lifeboat number 4 to safety while barking continuously. He was brought on board, and after holding his paws on the rail looking for Murdoch, who perished in the sinking, he received medical attention and was adopted by the Carpathia's master at arms. However, there is no full evidence or mention to suggest that Murdoch owned a dog, and therefore this myth was made up as a form of yellow journalism. While this may be the saddest subject to tell, the story of the Titanic's dogs shows that the love for their companions is strong. With modern dog owners especially, dogs can truly be indeed best friends to humanity.